My name is Franklin, and this is the case they chose to forget. The first body was discovered in late October, when the city was already slipping into winter but hadn't admitted it yet. The days were shorter, the air smelled of wet asphalt and old leaves, and most people had started coming home earlier, locking themselves inside before dark without really thinking about why. It was the kind of season when silence feels heavier than usual. The victim lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of a pre-war building, the kind with thin walls, unreliable heating, and a hallway that never seemed fully lit. Nothing about the place stood out. That was the problem. She was found in the kitchen. The door wasn't forced. The lock wasn't broken. In fact, the door was unlocked when the police arrived, swinging slightly from a draft coming through a cracked window. At first glance, it looked like a domestic incident, the sort of call officers respond to every night and forget by morning. But the scene didn't behave like one. The wounds were excessive. Not chaotic, not emotional. Deliberate, repeated. As if the violence had a structure to it, even if no one could yet explain what that structure was. The neighbors hadn't heard anything. No screams. No struggle loud enough to cut through the walls. One of them mentioned music playing earlier in the evening, but couldn't remember what kind. Another said they assumed she had company. No one called the police. By the time the body was discovered, the city had already moved on to the next day. At first, the case didn't make headlines. It wasn't the kind of murder that demanded attention right away. There was no forced entry, no missing property, no obvious motive. The victim had no known enemies, no recent conflicts, no reason to expect violence. It was filed as an isolated incident. That classification lasted 11 days. The second body appeared less than a mile away, in an apartment with almost the same layout. Same kind of building, same kind of hallway, same quiet, dimly lit kitchen at the center of it all. Again, the door was unlocked. Again, there were no signs of forced entry. Again, no one reported hearing anything unusual. This time, however, the medical examiner noticed something unsettling. The wounds followed a similar pattern. Not identical. Killers rarely repeat themselves perfectly, but close enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. The realization came slowly, and then, all at once. Someone was choosing these apartments, choosing these people, and walking in without resistance. After the second murder, the word pattern finally entered the conversation. Until then, the investigators had been cautious. 2 deaths in a city of this size could still be coincidence. People die violently every day, often for reasons that never fully surface. But when similarities begin to stack up, same building age, same time of evening, same lack of forced entry, coincidence becomes harder to defend. Both victims were women in their early 30s. Both lived alone. Both worked regular jobs that required no public exposure, no risk, no controversial connections. Neither had a criminal record. Neither had reported threats or suspicious behavior in the weeks before their deaths. Their lives, on paper, were quiet. Too quiet to explain what happened to them. The police canvassed the buildings again, this time more thoroughly. Officers knocked on doors that had already been knocked on once. They asked the same questions, hoping for different answers. Most people remembered nothing. A few remembered something small but dismissed it at the time. A sound, a shadow in the hallway, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone they recognized. Nothing solid enough to hold on to. One neighbor from the second building mentioned seeing a man in the stairwell earlier that night. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He stood near the window, smoking, as if waiting for someone. The neighbor assumed he lived there. No description beyond that. Average height. Dark jacket. Nothing that would make a person memorable. That detail didn't make the report's first page. It barely made the second. The third murder forced the city to pay attention. It happened in early November, when the temperature dropped suddenly and the first frost appeared on car windshields overnight. People were staying indoors more often, windows closed, televisions louder than usual. The city felt insulated, sealed off. The victim was found just before sunrise. This time, it wasn't an apartment. It was a small rented townhouse, slightly removed from the previous locations, but still within the same general area. Again, no forced entry. Again, no signs of a struggle loud enough to alert neighbors. But there was something different. The victim had tried to escape. The marks on the floor told that story clearly. Drag marks, broken glass. A chair knocked over near the back door. Whatever sense of safety existed at the beginning of the encounter had dissolved by the end of it. The killer stayed anyway. That detail mattered. Most criminals flee once control is lost. Panic introduces mistakes. This one adapted. Finished what he came to do. Left the same way he arrived, without rushing, without leaving behind anything that could easily identify him. The house was quiet again by morning. At this point, the task force was assembled. Detectives from different precincts were pulled in, some reluctantly, others with a sense of unease they didn't try to hide. The files were laid out side by side, photos compared, timelines overlapped. The conclusion was unavoidable. They weren't dealing with a spontaneous offender. They weren't dealing with rage. They were dealing with someone methodical, someone who understood routines, someone who knew how people lived when they believed they were safe. This is usually where the public imagines a monster. They picture someone visibly unstable, someone who stands out in a crowd, someone whose face announces danger. Real investigations rarely give you that luxury. The profile that emerged was less dramatic. Male, likely employed, comfortable moving through residential spaces without attracting attention. Someone who could knock on a door and not immediately raise alarm. Someone who could be let inside. That last detail changed everything, because it meant the victims hadn't just been chosen, they had participated. When detectives re-examined the victims' recent histories, a pattern finally surfaced. Subtle, easy to miss unless you were already looking for it. All three had interacted with the same service provider within the month before their deaths. Not a delivery driver, not maintenance, a community liaison program, official sounding, harmless. The kind of initiative cities roll out quietly and forget to advertise properly. The man's job was to check in on residents, distribute informational pamphlets, and report safety concerns to the city. He carried identification. He wore a badge. He asked polite questions. He had been inside all three homes. By the time the police realized this, he had already stopped showing up to work. His apartment was empty when they arrived. No signs of struggle, no rushed packing, just absence. Neighbors described him as quiet, respectful, easy to overlook. Someone who smiled but didn't linger. Someone who lived alone and didn't bring visitors home. Everyone knew him. No one knew anything about him. Once the connection was made public inside the department, the murders stopped being quiet. Patrols increased in the affected neighborhoods. Unmarked cars sat idling near apartment complexes. Residents were advised to verify identification before opening their doors, though the warning came too late to matter for some. The city was learning in real time and learning slowly. 2 weeks passed without an incident, and some began to hope the killer had moved on. That hope collapsed on a Sunday night. The fourth murder occurred just after 9 p.m., earlier than the others, in a building that had already been canvassed twice. The victim was a man this time, mid-40s, recently divorced. No prior connection to the previous cases beyond geography. The door was unlocked. The violence was more direct, less controlled. The medical examiner noted signs of struggle, defensive wounds on the arms, bruising around the neck. It wasn't frantic, but it was faster, as if the killer was no longer interested in maintaining a certain image. He was adapting. What unsettled investigators most wasn't the brutality. It was the choice of victim. The pattern had shifted. Within days, the fifth body was found, then the sixth. The timeline compressed. What had once taken weeks now took days. Locations varied more widely, spreading beyond the original cluster of neighborhoods. Apartments, townhouses, a ground floor unit with a view of the street. In one case, the victim had called a friend earlier that evening and mentioned someone knocking on the door, saying he was from the city. The call ended normally. No distress, no urgency. By the time the friend became concerned, it was already morning. The killer was accelerating, but he wasn't losing control. That distinction mattered. Escalation usually brings mistakes. Witnesses, physical evidence, panic. This escalation came with confidence. He had learned what worked and what didn't. He no longer needed the same cover story. In some cases, he didn't use one at all. He knocked. People opened the door. The task force grew strained. Detectives worked overlapping shifts, chasing leads that went nowhere. The man's name appeared in personnel databases, but the identity behind it seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Records were incomplete, references vague. His background checks clean in the way only shallow checks are clean. Someone had failed to look closely. That failure now had a body count. Public pressure mounted. Media coverage shifted from cautious reporting to speculation. Residents began installing additional locks, refusing door-to-door services, calling police over strangers in stairwells and hallways. The city felt watched, and in response, the killer changed again. The seventh murder broke one of his own rules: forced entry. A back window shattered. Glass scattered across the kitchen floor. The scene was louder, messier, impossible to ignore. It drew attention in a way the previous killings had avoided. Investigators debated whether this was desperation or evolution. The answer came quickly. It was neither. It was provocation. A note was found for the first time, not at the scene, but delivered to the local press 2 days later. Typed. No fingerprints, no handwriting to analyze. Just a sentence. You let me in. That sentence did more damage than any weapon he had used, because it shifted the blame, not onto the victims, at least not directly, but onto the system that had taught them to trust appearances, badges, procedures. Onto the city itself. Fear deepened, becoming something heavier than panic. Suspicion. People stopped opening doors. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Every knock became a question. Internally, the task force began to fracture. Some believed the killer was escalating toward something larger, something public. Others argued he would retreat now that he had forced attention. Resources were divided. Surveillance spread thin. And in that confusion, he made his boldest move yet. The eighth murder forced the task force to abandon the idea that this case could still be contained. It happened on a weekday afternoon, shortly after 3 o'clock, when most people assume the city is awake enough to keep them safe. The victim was found in a ground-floor office space converted into a small private counseling practice. The front door faced the street. The blinds were half open. People walked past. No one stopped. According to the timeline, the victim had a scheduled appointment. The receptionist had left early due to illness, something that later became an uncomfortable point of focus. Security cameras in nearby shops showed a man entering the building calmly, without hesitation. carrying a folder under his arm. He stayed inside for 23 minutes. When he walked back out, nothing about him suggested urgency. He adjusted his jacket, checked his phone, and merged into foot traffic like someone finishing an ordinary errand. Inside, the office told a different story. The violence was restrained but intentional. The killer had taken time. There were signs of control, of positioning, of a process repeated often enough to become efficient. The victim had been aware of what was happening long enough to understand the situation, but not long enough to stop it. That detail stayed with the investigators. Not the blood, not the injuries, the awareness. By now, the department was hemorrhaging credibility. Press conferences were held daily. Statements were careful, deliberately vague. Officials urged calm while privately acknowledging they had lost the initiative. The killer wasn't reacting to the investigation anymore. He was setting the pace. A review of the previous scenes revealed something that should have been noticed earlier. In several locations, the killer had repositioned objects after the murder. Chairs straightened, lights turned off, doors closed gently rather than left ajar. It wasn't about hiding evidence. It was about order. He wanted the scene to make sense to him. The 9th murder happened 48 hours later. This time, the victim survived long enough to speak. Barely. A neighbor heard a sound that didn't quite register as a scream. More like a sharp intake of breath, followed by something hitting the wall. When officers arrived, the victim was still conscious, though fading. Blood loss was severe. Speech came slowly, fragmented. He described a man who didn't rush, a man who kept talking, a man who seemed annoyed when interrupted. The victim couldn't give a face, couldn't give a name. But he remembered one thing clearly. The man had said calmly, almost conversationally, "This always takes longer than people think." The victim died on the way to the hospital. That statement reframed the entire case. This wasn't someone killing out of impulse or compulsion alone. This was someone who planned for duration. Someone who expected interruptions and knew how to manage them. Someone who had rehearsed the interaction, not just the act. The killer wasn't improvising. He was refining. Internal disagreements turned into open conflict. Some investigators pushed for citywide lockdown measures. Others argued that visible force would only push the killer further underground. Surveillance teams were stretched thin, chasing dozens of tips generated by public paranoia. Most of those tips led nowhere, but one didn't. A patrol officer flagged a report that had been dismissed weeks earlier. A complaint about a city employee who lingered too long during apartment visits, who asked unnecessary questions, who returned unannounced. The complainant had never followed up. The file had been closed. The name matched. So did the description. By the time warrants were issued, the address was already abandoned. Again. The 10th murder was the one that broke protocol. It occurred less than 6 hours after the 9th, making it the shortest interval yet. Same neighborhood as before. Same calm entry. Same controlled execution. But this time, the killer made a mistake. He stayed too long. A security camera captured him exiting the building with blood on his sleeve, visible even in poor lighting. Not enough to identify him conclusively, but enough to confirm what the department had feared. He wasn't unraveling. He was pushing limits. That night, the city changed. Police presence became unavoidable. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods that had once gone quiet after dark. Residents slept with lights on. Doors were double-checked, then checked again. And somewhere inside that tension, the killer adjusted once more. Because escalation only goes one way, toward exposure. The break came on a night when the city was wrapped in rain. Not the kind that falls suddenly and hard, but a steady, patient rain that soaks into streets and sidewalks, dulls sound, and makes everything feel slower than it really is. By midnight, the gutters were overflowing, and the air smelled of wet concrete and rusted metal. It was the kind of night where people stayed inside without needing a reason. That mattered. A traffic camera near the site of the 10th murder picked up a partial license plate. Nothing definitive. 2 numbers, 1 letter, but enough to narrow thousands of vehicles down to a few dozen. When that data was cross-referenced with parking permits issued to city employees, one match stood out. The vehicle was registered to a man who no longer existed in any official schedule. The address led investigators to the edge of the city, where residential streets give way to older industrial zones. Warehouses, storage units, buildings that had been repurposed and abandoned more than once. The area was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Streetlights flickered. Rain collected in uneven pools along cracked asphalt. Somewhere nearby, a piece of loose metal struck a wall rhythmically, moved by the wind. Officers set up surveillance just before 2 a.m. They didn't expect him to return. That was the second mistake. At 2:37 a.m., a figure appeared at the far end of the block. He walked without an umbrella, head slightly lowered, jacket darkened by rain. His pace was unhurried, consistent. He turned into a narrow alley that led behind the building under observation, a former municipal records office scheduled for demolition. Thermal imaging showed a single heat signature inside moments later. The call went out quietly. Units moved in without sirens, without lights, spreading through the surrounding streets like a slow tide. Doors were closed softly. Radios stayed muted. Rain covered the sound of boots on pavement. For once, the city worked in their favor. Inside the building, the layout was worse than expected. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, offices subdivided over decades, walls added and removed without logic. Water dripped steadily from a cracked pipe somewhere above the second floor. Officers advanced methodically, room by room, floor by floor. They found evidence immediately: personal items, documents taken from victims' homes, a stack of city-issued pamphlets identical to those he had once distributed, now marked and annotated in the margins. Dates, addresses, notes written in a precise, controlled hand. This wasn't a hideout. It was an archive. That realization sent a quiet ripple through the team. He had been here before, often, comfortably. A noise came from the upper level. Not footsteps, movement. A door opening, then closing again. Officers froze. Rain hammered the windows harder now, driven sideways by wind. Somewhere in the building, a timer beeped once and stopped. A team moved up the stairwell, weapons raised, breathing controlled. At the top of the stairs, they found a room with the lights still on. Empty. The window was open. Cold air poured in, carrying rain and the distant sound of traffic. A fire escape ladder rattled faintly against the brick wall outside. By the time officers reached the street, it was already too late. A witness later reported seeing a man emerge from the side of the building and walk calmly into the rain, blending into the darkness. No running, no urgency. Just another figure moving through a city that had learned too late how to look away. Minutes later, a second team discovered what had bought him time. A small fire had been set in the lower offices. Not enough to spread quickly, but enough to trigger alarms and redirect resources. The smoke was thin, deliberate, controlled, just like everything else. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a mist. Police tape fluttered weakly in the damp air. Steam rose from sewer grates. Officers stood in small groups, exhausted, staring at a building that felt suddenly hollow. They had been inside his space. They had touched his records. They had missed him by minutes. The investigation officially ended in early spring. By then, the city had begun to thaw. Snow receded into dirty piles along sidewalks. Construction resumed. Windows were opened again, cautiously at first. Life moved forward in the way it always does, slowly, unevenly, and without asking permission from the past. No further murders were reported. Weeks passed, then months. The task force was quietly dissolved. Officers were reassigned. Files were boxed, labeled, and transferred to long-term storage. Press inquiries slowed, then stopped entirely. Without new bodies, there was no longer a case to chase, only a record to maintain. The man was never found. His name remained in the system, flagged but inactive. His photograph, pulled from an old ID badge, aged quickly in people's memory. Tips still came in from time to time. Sightings in other cities, rumors passed between neighbors, strangers who looked like him. None of it led anywhere. The building near the industrial zone was demolished 6 months later. The site became a parking structure. The archive he had built inside it vanished under concrete and rebar, reduced to an entry in an evidence log and a handful of photographs. The objects he collected were returned to families when possible. Some things couldn't be returned. In internal reviews, the department focused on procedural failures, incomplete background checks, oversight gaps, a system designed for efficiency rather than scrutiny. Changes were proposed. Some were implemented. Most were forgotten. That too was familiar. What lingered was not fear, but something quieter. Distrust. People no longer opened doors the way they used to. Badges were checked twice. Conversations through closed doors became normal. The city learned a new habit and never quite unlearned it. The killer didn't need to remind them. Years later, one detail continued to bother investigators who had worked the case. During the review of archived materials, a pattern emerged that had gone unnoticed at the time. A handful of the annotated pamphlets recovered from the warehouse listed addresses that were never connected to any crime scene. They were simply crossed out. No explanation, no notes, just addresses. When those locations were checked retroactively, nothing was found. No incidents, no reports, no deaths. Only people who had lived there once and moved away shortly after. The case remains officially open. Unsolved, inactive, filed. And every so often, in another city, someone mentions a man who seems to know how things work, who carries himself like he belongs, who asks the right questions and leaves without being remembered. Everyone knows him. No one knows where he is.